I'll call it near final draft. I'm going to have copies printed up and available for all of you later today. We're going to release it publicly on Monday. It'll be up on our website, of course, and we'll be distributing it through a number of channels. But as I said, I'm going to have copies of it printed up at some point later today, and it'll be available for those of you who would like some incredible and captivating airplane reading on the trip home tomorrow. And you're also, of course, you'll see my name and email address on the front page of it, and welcome to just send me some feedback if you wish, or talk to me about it in person if you happen to read it. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Feige, and thank you very much.
It's good to see everybody today. Our third day of the conference, still going strong. Glad to see everybody got up and made it this morning. Yeah. Rick, where are you? All right. Hey! Other Rick. Okay, so on to the content of the day. I have been talking about the next speaker to a few different people at the conference, and I found when people, how do you describe, George Nield from the Federal Aviation Administration? What I kept saying to people was, well, George is speaking first thing in the morning, and most of us know George. If you don't know George and you're in the business, or you haven't heard of him and don't know who he is, you've got much bigger problems than whatever we're talking about. As you guys know, the Office of Space Transportation at the FAA is the licensing agent that allows those of us who are launching things commercially or trying to launch things commercially, they're the ones who license us. So, if you're not talking to these guys, or if you haven't even had a preliminary conversation with these guys about your idea, then you've got some catching up to do, and I hope this conference is the place that you do it. So, without any more of me rambling on and lamenting the fact that I'm awake this early in the morning, let me introduce George Nield of the FAA.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to be part of New Space 2006. I thought I'd talk to you this morning about three questions that always seem to come up whenever people are discussing commercial human spaceflight. How soon, how safe, and how much? Since it's been a while since we've seen any commercial rockets flying around with people on board, I've heard some people ask, what's going on? Is anything happening? Well, those are some pretty reasonable questions, so let's see if we can answer them. 4 decades ago, Stephen Stills wrote a song that became rather popular in some circles. It was actually about a totally different subject, but it began with an observation that seems to me to be particularly appropriate for where we are in commercial spaceflight. There's something happening here, he wrote. What it is ain't exactly clear. To both serious student and casual observer alike, what's going on right now in commercial human spaceflight may not be entirely clear, but I think the general consensus that something is happening, and indeed a great deal is. On the surface, there does seem to be a lull. After all, no passenger-carrying commercial rockets are flying. Aside from a few dramatic excursions over the Mojave Desert back in 2004, the skies have been relatively quiet. So what really is happening here? Is it possible that momentum has stalled? I don't think so. In fact, it seems to me that we're following a fairly typical timeline for adopting new forms of transportation. To illustrate, let me step back in time to a vastly different era with a strangely similar environment. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers made their epic flight. And then, nothing, or at least very little that was visible. The Wrights went back to Dayton and flew around Huffman Prairie for a couple of years. Glenn Curtiss was in his New York shop, still building motorcycle engines and bicycles, but beginning to think about aviation. Louis Blériot was in his workshop designing and building his version of an aircraft. Alberto Santos Dumont was in his own shop doing the same, and so were others. The fact is, in the years immediately following the first Wright flight, a lot was going on. It just wasn't going on in the sky. It was shop work, design, specification, and experiments, bench testing, craftsmanship. All these were the kind of things that would help get you where you wanted to go, unless you were trying to get into the newspapers. Had the term existed, observers might even have said that the infant aviation industry was having an identity crisis. But that's not really the case. What was really happening was that a lot of people were trying to come up with an understanding of a brand new technology and then figuring out how to implement it in a practical way. The pioneers of aviation were learning then what the pioneers of commercial human spaceflight have already to understand, namely that transforming an idea from a dream to a functional piece of hardware takes a surprising amount of heavy lifting. That's what has been going on for the last couple of years in commercial spaceflight. Just to give one example, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation has been working with a dozen or so entrepreneurs who are engaged at different stages in the development of a new generation of vehicles as they build, test, redesign, and then reassemble their vehicles. Glamorous? No, but it's the kind of essential work that will help them to achieve their ultimate goals. And we've seen this kind of thing before, where the headline event is just the prelude to the kind of longer-term developments that matter most. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Torrey Point back in 1869 made the history books, but the increase in railroad traffic that followed was what really changed history, as operational track miles grew at an average rate of about 11 miles per day for nearly the next half-century. And Lindbergh's New York to Paris flight in 1927, well, that was riveting theater, but the real significance could only be appreciated years afterward. The number of passenger miles flown by the public increased dramatically. Don't be surprised if something similar takes place in the wake of Spaceship One. It seems to me that where we are right now in commercial human spaceflight is in the prosaic aftermath of a milestone event. It's where the anonymous day-to-day work helps establish the value of the original breakthrough and leads to broader acceptance. Maybe the general public isn't much interested in that side of things. For them, it's a preface. But for the industry, it's the ready room before showtime. So there really is something happening here that's just happening off camera. And if you ask me how soon, I'll simply say very soon. In fact, well before the end of the decade. Since commercial human spaceflight is imminent, I think this is a good place to raise another one of those questions I listed at the outset. How safe? Early this fall, we will mark the anniversary of an event unprecedented in our history. Nothing like it had ever happened before or since. What a day it was. October 8th, 1956. Almost 50 years ago. The day Don Larson of the New York Yankees pitched the one and only perfect game in World Series history. If anything proves the rarity of perfection, that game was it. And if you look at Mr. Larson's major league career, you will see even more clearly how unusual perfection really is. During his lifetime, he won 81 games and lost 91 with 8 different teams. 2 years before his perfect game, he played for the Baltimore Orioles and went 3-21 on the season. Now, I'm confident that our overall record on commercial human spaceflight will be incomparably better than that, but we will not be perfect. Launch vehicle developers and policymakers alike need to understand that. As Congress pointed out in the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, space transportation is inherently risky. No question. But then again, there's risk associated with any form of transportation. In 2004, over 600 people died in aviation accidents just in the United States. More than 19,000 people died in passenger cars. Over 600 died in recreational boating. Now, please don't misunderstand. This is not a casualty forecast. The primary purpose and focus of everything we do in commercial space is and will continue to be safety. While all the other areas of transportation I mentioned emphasize safety too, when it comes to passenger-carrying rockets, I want to make it clear that safety will be at the top of every checklist, and in the middle, and at the bottom. Even so, it's necessary to keep in mind that the very fact that a rocket is involved means that there's a level of risk present that is not going to be found in any other form of travel. Before the first passengers fly, proposed rules now moving through the regulatory process will require informed consent. In other words, the passengers will need to be advised of the risks involved and agree to accept those risks. The flights will be made as safe as humanly possible. But we need to recognize that perfection is just not humanly probable. These commercial human space flights are going to be spectacular. The out-the-window views, the sounds, the sensations, and the risks. It's a package deal, and it's all part of the adventure. So let me now address the third question I raised. How much? Space flight is expensive. The cost of a space shuttle mission is huge. And the early prices for commercial human spaceflight will be noteworthy, to say the least, even for the wealthy. Virgin Galactic recently announced that they had already sold tickets to their first 150 passengers at about $200,000 a pop. They have thus far taken in about $15 million in ticket sales and deposits. Given that we're still about 2 years before they expect to start operations, it sounds like the initial market is in pretty good shape. But the key question is, will there be enough traffic to sustain an entire industry? If so, for how long? Will there really be a mass market? Maybe not at those prices. And if the price doesn't eventually come down through competition or through improvements in technology, the market could dry up and go away. But I see promise here. Let me explain. Back in the early 1960s, when people were just beginning to think seriously about missions to the moon, they had to deal with something called the three-body problem. It was very tough. The problem was to predict the behavior of the Earth, the moon, the spacecraft with absolute precision so that all would line up to achieve the desired end. It was, as they said then, sort of like trying to toss a tennis ball into a coffee can from 300 miles away while both were moving at breakneck speeds. For many years, a similar three-body problem stood in the way of commercial human spaceflight. But these three bodies had nothing to do with orbital mechanics. The three bodies in this case were capital, technology, and market. And it's only recently that they have all lined up to make commercial human spaceflight a realistic proposition. But today, a critical mass of private investment capital is starting to become available. Existing technology appears to be good enough, at least for suborbital flights, and a willing market exists. This is an extraordinary time, but it's not a static opportunity. Like the three bodies of the 1960s, these bodies are in motion as well. The market is willing, but only a small fraction of it is able to afford current prices. Capital is available, but that will only continue to be true for as long as there is a promise of an acceptable return on investment. And the technology must continuously improve. Fortunately, if history is a guide, it will. Look at the railroad era in the United States. Once tracks were in place, people traveled by train. But more customers emerged as Pullman built the luxury car, Westinghouse developed the air brake, and car couplers became more and more dependable. Those advances brought more confidence to the traveling public, and economies of scale followed, making travel more affordable. The same thing needs to happen, and I believe it will, as commercial human spaceflight advances. We've been talking about three key aspects of commercial human spaceflight this morning that seem to be recurring questions for the industry: how soon, how safe, and how much. As I bring these remarks to a close, let me add a fourth question. What has the FAA been doing in the spaceflight arena? Well, let me tell you first what we are not doing. 45 years ago this week, a NASA industry conference on the Apollo program convened in Washington to examine where things stood. The written guidelines they had assembled weighed more than 250 pounds. That may help to explain in part why Wernher von Braun said, "We can let gravity, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming." We at the FAA are making it a point to regulate to the extent necessary to assure safety of the uninvolved public while avoiding the kind of regulation that would be a barrier to the advancement of commercial space transportation. On the affirmative side, we are, as many of you know, hard at work on final regulations for passenger and crew on suborbital flights. We are also moving through the process to finalize the rules for experimental launch permits. On June 12th, we issued a license for operation of the Oklahoma Spaceport, effectively making it the 6th non-federal launch site in the United States. Our staff has been busy working with the X Prize Foundation, Las Cruces Airport, and the other lines of business within the FAA to prepare for activities at the X Prize in New Mexico this October. We're also in the process of evaluating applications for experimental launch permits from 7 different developers, some of whom hope to fly in the Lunar Lander competition at the X Prize Cup, and some of whom are concentrating on developing vehicles that can eventually carry passengers. All of this is in addition to our ongoing involvement with ELVs, including Delta, Sea Launch, and Falcon 1. And oh, by the way, we have now had 178 licensed launches without any fatalities, serious injuries, or property damage to the uninvolved public. That's a record that we are very proud of and one that we plan to keep intact. So let me say finally, whether it's the roar of the rockets or the quiet intensity of the shop, something very special is happening here. And it won't be long before everybody knows about it. Thank you very much. Yes?
I wanted to ask a little bit more about the Lunar Lander Challenge. How would you characterize the state of preparations for that? You mentioned that something like 7 different developers have permit applications that you're evaluating. Do you expect in some cases there will be some of those permits that just can't be dealt with in time for the Lunar Lander Challenge, even though you'd like to do that?
Well, we're doing the best we can with what we've got. I think we're ahead of where we were last year, but again, this is a new event being planned, and there are different things that will be happening this year, different vehicles, different events, probably more people. The experimental launch permit is a new approval process. We're still figuring out how that works and what's involved. According to the statute, 120 days to take a sufficiently complete permit application to get to the final decision on go or no go. And so time is short between now and October for the X Prize Cup. But I mean, we're just going to do the best we can with what we've got, and we'll see where we end up.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned safety and risk of the human space flight. Sure. Human space flight. Has the FAA worked on any regulatory standards in terms of safety and risk that acceptable by the public in terms of licensing requirements in that aspect? So at what standard, what level of risk is acceptable for licensing some of the commercial launches?
Okay. Question, and the answer is no, there is no standard in terms of how safe it has to be to fly a passenger. The way Congress has set up this system for right now, it's recognizing that this is a risky undertaking, and so the approach that we're going to take, at least for now, is to make sure that prospective passengers understand the risks involved, what the safety records of the vehicle are, any problems that have been encountered, and so forth. And if they understand all that and they still are willing to hop on board, then sign this form and have at it and have a great time. However, we still have in place our responsibility to protect the uninvolved public on the ground, and there's no compromise, no change in that. And there are quantitative standards in terms of how safe that activity has to be, and so that's what we really concentrate on. And in terms of the crew and the passengers, the idea is, well, let's just experience first on how this works. We don't want to be too safe in the sense that we're being safe by forcing people to stay on the ground, because then we're going to strangle the industry. So we want to get some experience first, see what works, see what's important, and then we may come back and decide that some particular numerical standards are appropriate.
I'm not sure if you just answered my question or not, but I will. It sounds like you did, but had heard comments from someone at ISDC about making sure that the passengers were safe, and a few regulations regarding that were missing. Does that sound like you've answered that, or is there other issues involved?
Congress has specifically said, FAA, you can't put out any regulations intended to protect the passengers or crew, at least for the next 8 years, unless there's an accident where someone is killed or a close call, and we can identify that. So it's pretty much a hands-off attitude that goes along with the informed consent approach. Don't let anybody think that this is just like stepping onto an airliner. This is not. This is different. There are risks. If you understand those risks, you may proceed.
George, Stu Witt.
Yes, sir.
George, 4 years ago, there was an attitude that was, I think, universally accepted around our campus, that it was an us and them attitude. Us, them, being FAA. I don't see that at all, frankly, based on performance. But if I were to ask you, have you missed any launches due to regulatory holdup anywhere in the RLV activity on the United States? And second part of the question, if you could turn to industry and say, you know, over the last 4 years, some theme has come out of the applicants, either be operators or spaceports alike, that if you had done this, it might have aided in helping us out. What comes to mind? Because I can't think of anything you haven't done as a site. But what comes to mind on your end? what could we have done, but have we missed any launches because of regulation?
Excellent question, and for those who don't know, Stu Witt is the manager of the Mojave Spaceport, our first inland spaceport, and so we salute you. And to answer the question, to the best of our knowledge, no launch has ever been canceled or delayed as a result of the paperwork in the FAA. We do our hardest to make sure that the developers and the operators can meet the schedules that they lay out. Now, there's difficult work to be done, and there are slips in a program that occur because of technology and other things that are happening that may be unexpected. But in terms of getting a license, that type of thing, no, we haven't caused anyone to have to slip their program. So that's something we feel good. We'll certainly continue to try and work with the developers to meet the particular schedules that they're shooting for. In terms of what could be different, I think we all need to recognize that this is something new. We need to keep the communications lines open. We are learning. We learned an awful lot from Spaceship One and from Mojave's license and from X-Corps activities and so forth. So we're a lot better now than we were when we started that process, and we're trying to crank those lessons into our processes so that we don't make the same mistake twice. We'll make different ones. But yes, I appreciate the comments, and we think things are improving, and we're getting there. We're making progress.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm interested in your view. I understand the FAA is obeying Congress and not issuing any regulations concerning safety standards. Have any of the spaceports that have been licensed or any of the states dealt with safety standards?
Well, let me make sure that I'm saying it clearly. The restraint on issuing safety standards has to do with the safety of the passengers specifically.
That's what I'm referring to.
Clearly, there are safety standards in place for the entire operation, and there are safety things that we look at in terms of the spaceports too, in terms of storage of hazardous propellants, quantity, distance, relationships, how far away the public is kept from dangerous operations and things like that. And so those continue to be incorporated in our licensing activities with the spaceports, and they continue to be enforced.
My question, though, is whether you're aware of any states or spaceports that are looking at safety regulations for the passengers on the planes.
Not to the best of my knowledge, and of course, if we start to have individual states or communities come up with different kinds of regulations that apply to transportation, then it's going to make it a lot more difficult to have a unified transportation system, whatever your mode. So I'd be very interested in hearing about developments along that.
Thank you.
Okay. One up front here.
You know, as the number of groups increase and your responsibility is you're holding that together, I mean, where are you folks on your budgets? I mean, the number of people you have involved. I know it's always been a struggle trying to get the budgets. I'm sure you would like 6 times more than you get. But are you at a point of, you know, you're going to have more of these groups coming at you and more duties and functions that you've got to serve here? Are you in trouble as far as budgets? You got enough people to pull these things together?
Well, we're busy right now. We recognize that the entire government has budget challenges, and so everybody has to suck up a little bit to get the job done and to make do with a little bit less than they'd like. So we recognize that. Our attitude has been that this next year or so is going to tell us whether we're going to be able to make it through at this level or not. We think the workload is going to really skyrocket if the number of permits we get in continues to grow, if the number of developers who are really able to successfully follow through and start flying is anywhere close to the numbers that we're seeing, then we're probably going to need some more help. But we don't want to cry wolf, and so we're able to get the job done right now, and we're just going to see how it goes in this next year, and then we may have to go back and say, you know, to keep the process moving, to make sure that no one has to wait for the red tape, then we're going to need some more resources. So we're going to wait and see this next year, see how it turns out. Okay, any others?
Yeah, George, I think I speak on behalf of the entire community when I say that we really appreciate not only you, but your entire organization for the support you've given to this industry, and as much for what you haven't done as what you've done. First, do no harm, and the non-bureaucratic way in which and proactive way in which you've approached this, it's really appreciated. My question is, what about the extension of from the suborbital to the orbital, and particularly on the on-orbit and the re-entry kinds of things? Do you foresee that the orbital will have an extension of the same kind of treatment that's being handed out to the suborbital, and what time frame do you think this might happen on?
Okay, some great questions there. Let's take it apart a little bit. If you look at an orbital mission, you might break it up into three parts: the launch phase, the on-orbit phase, the re-entry phase. Under the current law, you need a license to conduct a launch and to conduct a re-entry. Right now, there is no entity within the U.S. that is responsible for the on-orbit oversight. That's an unregulated regime, if you will. And I assume the thinking is the primary duty is protect the uninvolved public on the ground. During the on-orbit activities, the uninvolved public on the ground is not in danger, so we don't need to have a regulator taking a look at that phase. That may change in the future, but right now that's where it is. And in terms of the law and the regulations, we have those in place right now to handle reusable launch vehicles, including orbital vehicles. It's just we haven't had the opportunity to license them. They haven't been waiting there at our door saying, here's what we want to do and here's when we want to do it. So we're ready in terms of the best we can do before we see a real vehicle with a real mission. And rather than trying to get too much more detailed or fine-tune anything too early, I think we'd like to see some more suborbital experience and see how it goes. And then if we think we need some changes to handle the orbital regime, we'll do that. And probably that's a few years downstream, and so things should work out nicely in terms of figuring out whether we have the balance right between allowing creative design and activity and maintaining the safety. Okay, one in the back.
George,
Yes.
as rocket plane's #1 passenger who signed up to go into space, I'd like to know if there are any government agencies that you know about that are communicating with any passengers on what the passengers actually feel are safe and what they want to see regulated and what they want to see in these vehicles.
Okay, Rita, let me just say that our office is very interested in your thoughts and those of other passengers. When we do these regulations, the way the rulemaking process is set up, we draft out our guesses as to what should be included, what should be allowed, what should be prohibited, and we publish them in the Federal Register, and we say, okay, you've got 60 days, everybody. If you don't like something in there, let us know, and we'll try to take that into account and maybe fine-tune things a little bit. So we've used that general process and have gotten some good feedback from the public at large, from the developers, from other government agencies, and we're trying to incorporate those thoughts before we get to the final rules that are issued. So best wishes to you, and thanks at all.